Think of America, and you think of many things. You think of the land, of vast resources of natural wealth. You think of industry, of abundant production of the necessities and conveniences of modern civilization. You think of people, born to or raised in the freedom which has made this nation great. Think of America, and you think of its broad avenues of approach to the immigrants, travelers, and merchants of all the world. The avenues of approach to America are two-way avenues, and of necessity, they are by sea. The intersection of these avenues between the land and the sea compose the American ports. These are busy intersections, busy with ships, busy with cargo handling equipment, and above all, busy with people at work. The ports of America comprise one of our largest and most important industries. In this one port alone are employed more than 50,000 people. This same port handles an annual volume of cargo valued at more than $3 billion. Through these ports, we trade with friends overseas and with neighbors at home. In a recent year, the volume of foreign and domestic cargo handled through all U.S. ports amounted to nearly 800 million tons. The value of foreign cargo alone was in excess of $31 billion. Supporting this nationwide port industry are nearly 4 million employees, representing labor, industry, and public service agencies, whose combined earning power is many, many billions of dollars yearly. As vital as they are, ports are also vulnerable. They are vulnerable to all the furies of the sea. They are vulnerable to disastrous accidents. And also vulnerable as logical targets for enemy attacks. In the port industry, as in all of American industry, preparedness planning is a responsibility of highest priority. Such planning is broadly inclusive, not only for the protection of personnel against possible attack, but for the protection of public and private port facilities against pilferage, sabotage, fires, and other natural disasters. In this industry, defense against disaster is a responsibility shared by many groups: management and labor, port authority and police, civil defense and military. Like other American industries, however, the port industry has recognized that disaster control begins with a plan. Planning for the operation of seaports under emergency conditions is not a responsibility of individual ports alone. It is also the official responsibility of the Maritime Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Complying with the President's directions, the Maritime Administration has developed this prototype plan for the operation of seaports under emergency conditions. A guide that, with minor modifications, can be used by any U.S. port. The Maritime Administration asks each port authority to establish a port emergency planning committee of top-level individuals, selected from its own staff and from such other segments of the port industry as the terminal operators, pilots associations, and others, according to the individual port.
The committee's job is to direct and coordinate the activities of the planning group for the port. This means the cooperation with the Coast Guard and other governmental agencies. I, as chairman, have the authority to call on any segment of the port operation or port industry to help the committee in these planning activities. I receive assistance from a vice chairman and a permanent secretary. My permanent secretary is also the defense coordinator. And I have a number of men assigned to the committee who assist in our various duties and responsibilities, such as emergency port operations.
Establishing an emergency operating site is my job. From this base, we can supervise the continued operations of the port under emergency conditions.
I am responsible for the establishment of relocation centers. In the event of an emergency, assigned personnel will report to their center.
Establishing policies for 2 local training programs is my responsibility. One program will cover civil defense and disaster training, the other emergency port operations training. This will include reconstruction and restoration.
I work very closely with the Coast Guard. Our responsibility is to formulate plans for the security of the port facilities and to take care of the personnel in the event of a civil defense disaster or any other natural emergency. I also have the responsibility of the securing of the documents and records that are in the port.
Administrative planning for legal responsibilities is my job on the committee. For example, if a national emergency is declared, we must look into releases from contractual obligations. We must also study insurance coverage for war damage and other legal situations resulting from the emergency.
Our committee keeps continuous liaison with all federal agencies concerned in port operations, both under normal and emergency conditions. And I serve as a link with those government agencies.
These multiple responsibilities require the committee to do extensive planning, and we have the added responsibility of making these plans operational. This may be required on very short notice. We have set up working groups, and these groups do the legwork for the committee.
My group will make the necessary preparations for the maintenance of operations of the port in the event of a natural disaster or any other type of disaster.
We're responsible for making arrangements for record and document security.
There are other groups, such as port evaluation, communication, material inventory, equipment dispersal, and port security. The number of groups will depend upon the need of the individual ports. Not all, of course, will be the same, but what will be the same is an organized plan with which every port in the United States can prepare for emergency operations. In offering this prototype plan, it is hoped that each port will develop a final plan, not only for its own use, but for submission to the Maritime Administration for review and comment. In 1959, the Maritime Administration offered invitations to every port in the United States to participate in emergency port planning.
The response was enthusiastic. Here are some of the final plans for survival and emergency operation prepared by United States ports. Although the ports represented here have many differences in location, facilities, types, and volume of cargo handled, they all share one great advantage. They are prepared for survival and emergency operations. Here, in this West Coast port, we can see how one port has planned to survive and continue operations after a disaster. How this port will survive and continue operations after a disaster depends upon the disaster. If it's a major one, and it is completely knocked out, there are plans to shift operations to any other port on the coast that can handle it. However, if partially knocked out, it will continue to operate with whatever is left, even if it's only one berth and a handful of men. This is the port operating headquarters. In event of disaster, the first requirement is to protect all employees from fallout and keep the operating headquarters functional. This couldn't be done if this building were destroyed or seriously damaged. For that reason, alternate headquarters have been established for emergency operations. This is one of them, the first alternate. This site was selected for several reasons. It is several miles from the primary headquarters. It offers reasonable protection against blast and fire, and it provides fallout protection for the personnel required to maintain it. This facility is permanently provided with the office equipment, duplicate port files, and communication systems needed to continue administration of the port in an emergency. Right now, an emergency headquarters team is having one of its regular practice sessions to make sure everything is in working order. In addition to telephone circuits, there is a shortwave radio set for both sending and receiving. All emergency headquarters personnel have been instructed how to use it. This site, like the primary site, is stocked with 2 weeks' supplies of food and water, together with first aid needs and radiological monitoring equipment. With these basic but essential supplies and equipment, the headquarters group can continue to direct the activities of the port from this alternate site, during and after an emergency if necessary. But to keep this port operating in an emergency, more than a functional headquarters is needed. Port facilities must be available for emergency use, and that means maintaining an up-to-date list of all watercraft, docks, warehouses, stevedoring equipment, vehicles, and about everything else in the port inventory. The responsibility of compiling and maintaining a material inventory of the port is shared by the working groups on material inventory and port evaluation. However, the cooperation of almost every company on the waterfront is required to provide the basic information needed. How many forklift trucks are available in the port area? How many cranes? What are their capacities? Where are they located? These and other questions were put in questionnaire form to scores of companies operating in the port. And from their replies, from tug companies and lighterage firms, from stevedoring outfits and warehousemen, from truckers and shippers and many others, a detailed material inventory was compiled. Duplicate copies of this inventory are kept in an alternate headquarters operating site. And if the day comes when the alternate site is needed, the necessary records will be available to keep this port operating under emergency conditions. This is just a part of the story of preparedness planning on the West Coast. In this port, as in others, plans for survival and emergency operations not only require an inventory of material, they also require an inventory of manpower. For a closer look at this aspect of emergency operations planning, let's visit one of the Gulf Coast ports. It is agreed that to keep a port operating under emergency conditions, you need equipment and the men to handle the equipment. Thanks to the cooperation of both labor and management, an inventory of port resources includes a current list of available manpower. This list shows how many men are normally available in the port area workforce, what jobs they can perform, where to contact them in an emergency. Following a disaster, the availability of skilled manpower may be a critical problem. Operating companies on the waterfront know that too, and so do the men. For that reason, many companies sponsor emergency operations training programs. Take these employees, for example. Each man here is qualified to perform his own waterfront job. However, in this program, these men are taught additional skills they may be called upon to use during an emergency, such as operating cargo handling equipment or a gantry crane. They are also trained to handle small watercraft and to use communications equipment in case of an emergency. In many cases, these men volunteer for instruction in multiple skills in support of the Planning Committee's objective of overcoming a manpower shortage with a greater per-man capability in event of disaster to this port. At this port, as at all ports, training is a vital part of civil defense and emergency preparedness. For another kind of training, let's look at a port on the Great Lakes. It is hundreds of miles from the sea, but in this nuclear age, distance is no factor. And the Emergency Planning Committee knows that it can happen here. This is one of the emergency training classes, an important one, a class for shelter managers. The class is being held after hours in the conference room of one of the large waterfront companies. However, the class itself is composed of volunteers from many waterfront companies. The volunteers are stevedores, executives, and all other working groups in the port. The instructor is one of the county civil defense officials, whose participation in the program was arranged for by the Working Committee on Emergency Training. Shelter management is an important aspect of ensuring the availability of an adequate workforce in the port area after a nuclear attack. Since fallout is most likely to be a serious hazard anywhere in the port area, the Planning Committee sponsors radiological monitoring classes several times a year. Here, the instructor introduces the monitoring equipment. The cleaning up operation of a contaminated area is important. The Civil Defense Training Program also takes advantage of the medical self-help course offered by the U.S. Public Health Service. First aid instruction is an important part of the training. Civil defense planning in the community involves all of the fallout shelters in the port area. Some of these are located in municipally owned facilities. Others are located in privately owned waterfront structures. These shelters are identified, marked, and stocked as part of the National Fallout Shelter Program. If it ever becomes necessary to use this shelter, for example, these supplies of food and water will sustain 1,100 persons for 2 weeks. Other emergency supplies include sanitation needs, medical kits, and radiological monitoring equipment. Civil defense preparedness and training account for only part of the emergency planning, of course, but if it does happen here, if nuclear disaster cripples this port, all of the other plans for continued operation will depend upon this one plan, personal survival. One of the largest and busiest ports is on the Atlantic coast. In fact, it comprises several ports located along a river, and like most river ports, it has heavy maritime traffic and a complex of industry, much of it handling highly flammable material, such as oil, chemicals, hemp, and lumber. That facility was burned out last year. The firefighting equipment prevented damage to the adjacent piers, but the property damage was extensive. Fortunately, there was no loss of life. Fortunately, too, the company who operated this facility participated in the Port Security Microfilming Program. Here are some of the important records belonging to that company: its certificate of incorporation, bylaws, minutes of meetings, financial statements, and so forth. Although the original documents were destroyed in the fire, these microfilm copies are available for use in carrying on the firm's business. The Working Group on Records offers this service at no cost to any waterfront company. The Maritime Administration's prototype plan points out that the loss of vital company documents in a disaster would not only cripple the company administratively, but would also seriously handicap its ability to aid waterfront recovery and restoration of operation. Copies of microfilmed records are stored in this protected facility in vaults located 150 feet below ground in a mountain more than 100 miles away from here. event of disaster to the port, these records, containing the Port Committee's plans, as well as company documents, will be essential to recovery and restoration of port services. The Port Security Working Group is concerned with physical security of vital waterfront facilities, both public and private. In cooperation with private companies and the U.S. Coast Guard, we have arranged to issue personal identification cards to prevent unauthorized entry to waterfront facilities where continued operation is essential in emergencies, or where sabotage would impede recovery. Like other ports, many working groups are engaged in disaster control preparation to minimize the effects of attack and to speed recovery and restoration of port operations following disaster. This is a large port, one of the largest in the nation. But plans for emergency operation are not compounded by size nor complexity. If emergency preparations save one berth for one ship and the men and equipment to handle it, this port will continue to operate. Disaster preparedness and control in order to minimize the effects of attack and to maintain the capacity to serve essential users in an emergency. That is the philosophy of civil defense and emergency planning for ports. This motion picture has been produced for several reasons. One, to point out the urgent national need for emergency planning. Two, to invite the support of every United States port in this vital endeavor. And finally, to pay tribute to all who have, through hard work, perseverance, and above all, foresight, already forged an essential link in the maritime chain of preparedness planning.